Today's episode of The Bluff is sponsored by SITREP. SITREP is an notorious open-source intelligence app that provides the latest updates for over 180 countries and over 500 topics, allowing you to stay ahead and informed. Now available on Apple and Google. Thank you, SITREP, for sponsoring this episode.
Welcome back to the Bottom Line Up Front, an Artorias podcast. I'm Matt.
I'm Jonathan, the Chief Growth Officer at Artorias.
And I'm Stefano, the Chief Intelligence Officer of Artorias. And today we're joined again by our regular guest and subject matter expert in everything military affairs, John Lerear, also known as Defense Bulletin. John, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, guys. I think we're jumping into South America, LATAM today, so great to be here.
Absolutely. The exact conversation what we want to talk about is this is something we kind of alluded to in our previous episode, and it's really the culmination of the Donroe Doctrine or Monroe Doctrine 2.0. We saw this in the U.S. national security paper and the white paper that kind of was released and the national defense strategy of how the United States wanted to reprioritize and refocus on the Western Hemisphere, both from an organized crime perspective, combating cartels, combating drug trafficking, and the problems that is done on the American people and the domestic issues with the fentanyl crisis, etc., but also from a geopolitical aspect as well, related to China, Russia, Iran, etc., and how the United States understands and now wants to basically have this idea that we cannot secure our own country without securing our own hemisphere. And if we cannot secure our own hemisphere, basically, we cannot be the predominant geopolitical power in the world. But what's very interesting on this, and this is why we wanted to do this episode, is that it looks like what's really driving this forward is not necessarily just the U.S. military deployments in South America. We've seen the strikes that has happened in Southcom AOR, that it's at least once a week at a minimum. We see U.S. Southcom release footage of them conducting drone strikes against drug boats. But what's really driving this a lot is actual elections that are happening in South America, where basically the equivalent of, let's say, MAGA, for all intents and purposes in South America, these pro-MAGA, very conservative candidates are being elected into power. Colombia just had a runoff election where the conservative pro-Trump, some would even call far-right presidential candidate has won, who has taken a very hardline approach on security, basically told the FARC and the ELN and other groups, you must submit yourself to the state, or we're going to go after you. We're not going to continue the negotiations. In Peru, Fujimori, the daughter of kind of the authoritarian leader of Peru, Alberto Fujimori, she was elected in a very close, tied-off race, and that's another conservative candidate. Obviously, this continues the waves we've seen in Argentina, Chile, Bolivia, Honduras, Dominican Republic as being much more pro-American, Trinidad and Tobago, even Mexico, which on paper is left-leaning, has been taking a much more sincere approach and being much more acquiescent to American demands from migration and cartels. And even though Claudia Sheinbaum is left-leaning, she has taken a much more approach for the United States and taken a harder stance on a lot of these cartels to make sure the U.S. doesn't conduct unilateral military operations. And obviously, this is all happening in the backdrop of a very catastrophic humanitarian disaster this week in Venezuela, where, basically two back-to-back earthquakes killed, at least as of right now, as of this recording, has killed over 1,000 civilians. Those numbers, unfortunately, are expected to rise significantly. Some estimates may indicate that it might be, the tens of thousands of people are killed. And we've seen a significant humanitarian response led by the United States, led by U.S. Southern Command down to Venezuela to support Delcy Rodriguez, the acting president of Venezuela. And it's a very interesting dynamic where the U.S. military personnel are back in Venezuela, where in January this year, they were there to capture Nicolas Maduro in a U.S. military operation, and now in a humanitarian operation. And so this is the construct of this episode. Obviously, the situation in the Middle East continues. We're seeing significant tits for tats between the United States and Iran, and we continue to have that conversation with Israel and Lebanon. But I think the story that is not getting enough attention is Donroe Doctrine or Monroe Doctrine 2.0 and how the United States is consolidating itself in the Western Hemisphere. But with that, I'm going to go to my first question for Jonathan. Jonathan, obviously, we started this year in Venezuela, the operation that captured Nicolas Maduro. Delcy Rodriguez clearly is being much more sympathetic and acquiescence to American demands. She understands she cannot challenge Donald Trump. But what's very interesting is this wave of conservative candidates are being elected in South America. The people in South America want these conservative policies. They want a tougher stance on crime. They advocated by the ballot box being closer to the United States geopolitically. They, even understanding the sacrifice they might have in their largest economic partners for a lot of these countries is China. So what do you make of these conservative wins in Colombia and Peru that have just continued on in the last 2 years of this conservative wave that's sweeping South America? And how does that benefit the United States?
Yeah. So I guess I'll give a little bit of historical background for our listeners, just so they can see where I'm coming from with this. But going into the late 1990s and then definitely full force, the 2000, early 2010s, you have this leftist sort of what some people in the political science space have called pink tide, which were these l- left libertarian, left populist, occasionally socialist figures coming to power all across South America. And that was, that's due to a variety of factors. I would say for most countries, it came down to very strong populism from these leaders during those election stages, and it's almost always related to economics. I think that's one of the biggest political motivators within all of Latin America. And now you're seeing the exact opposite undoing all of that stuff, which is a mix of right libertarians, right populists, and even some hard to far right leaders, pretty much across the entire continent. And you've got that in places like, I would say, probably the two most notable figures in the early stages of these movements would definitely be people like Javier Milei in Argentina, and then people like Nayib Bukele in El Salvador. But obviously, these past few months, we're now starting to see that start to hit a lot of other countries like Peru, like Colombia, various Central American countries, various Caribbean countries. We might even continue to see it going into areas like Brazil and Chile. Um, the way I'm seeing this personally is it's very much rooted in the same economic concern. A lot of these countries are dealing with runaway inflation. They're dealing with extreme inequality. The poverty rates in some of these countries have only gotten worse during these previous left wing administrations. And there's also the violent crime that has spread through a lot of these countries because of a lack of order in the security apparatus, whether that be due to corruption or whether that be due to a lack of resources. And before I go any further with this, I don't want to say explicitly that's the fault of these previous governments. I think it's a little more complicated than that, because before this left wing era in Latin America, we did have notably right wing, if not outright militarist phase during much of the Cold War. And a lot of those problems still existed during this era. So I don't necessarily think it's one ideology's fault or another's. But it's something that I think not a lot of people are talking about, ironically, in my view, because it is such a big deal in many other elections across the world in the past 10 years, is the role of youth. You have a lot of people in the youth of these countries that are coming into their voting age. And there's a lot of these young people are seeing all the problems their countries have dealt with. And they're seeing all these populist leaders, regardless of their pasts. For example, in Peru, with the return of a Fujimori to the political scene, uh, you're starting to see a lot of these youth vote, mostly, I would say, from an economic point of view, not to throw away the security concerns. And we can go into this a little more later, but I definitely think there's also just a lot of international backing for this, specifically from the Trump administration, specifically from people in the MAGA movement, that's sort of giving these people a platform and letting them build domestic versions of MAGA relevant to their country. And that's kind of just like a good broad overview of how I feel about it, and we can definitely go into a
Actually,
lot more
Jonathan,
detail through the rest of the episode.
let,
Yeah,
yeah,
go ahead.
let me actually ask you a quick follow-on question before I go to John, because this is something that I think is very interesting, right? I mean, let's look at South America. We saw elections since El Salvador with Bukele and Javier Milei in Argentina. Just let's focus on the elections and the governments right now. We've seen conservative governments, and some of these conservative governments would have been considered fringe years ago. These far right candidates are now in power and taking a very pro-American stance. And let's look at it. Chile, right? Pro-USA far right candidate. Ecuador, U.S. military operations concurrent with the United States and Ecuador against Ecuadorian gangs. Another, right-wing candidate. Colombia just elected a far-wing candidate. We have Guyana, who has been very much, because of the situation with Escobedo and everything that's gone there, taken a much more pro-American stance. Honduras, pro-conservative, far-right candidate, also recently elected, right? Really, like outside of Cuba, the only real, in a democratic sense, right? So not even Cuba, but in the democratic sense, what we're seeing is Mexico and Brazil are the only left-wing candidates left. And both of those countries aren't challenging the United States. Brazil, for all intents and purposes, has kind of dropped the BRICS reality. I mean, in de facto, they haven't really carried that mantra that much anymore. Mexico has been very acquiescent to the American demands. It's a very interesting aspect. I would even be very cautious of referring Claudia Sheinbaum as being left-wing and much more populist from Morena and AMLO. But regardless, what's interesting in South America, unlike Europe, is that, as you alluded to historically, we saw the pink revolution, now we're seeing this conservative revolution. South America seems, from a political sense, to be much more intertwined and connected, where swings are very clear from a political spectrum. In Europe, you can have a situation where major European powers, one country elects a left-wing candidate, another country elects a right-wing candidate, some countries see the rise of the left, other countries see the rise of the right. In South America, though, for some reason, I would love your take why, we generally see these swings that most countries point either to the right or to the left. So it's very interesting now we're seeing to the right. Do you think in South America they're much more homogeneous than most people realize, and that's why we're seeing these swings?
Yeah, actually, I would say that's definitely a cause, because we did see President Bukele in El Salvador, and we did see President Milei in Argentina. I would say in the political space quite a while ago. Obviously, it's only been a handful of years, but in the political space, that's not very like it was a while ago, almost an entire election cycle ago, all things considered, for a lot of these countries, 3 to 4 plus years. I think the difference is that when it comes to Europe, you do have all these cultural underlying reasonings for these shifts. A lot of these countries have histories with certain kinds of ideologies, and they don't really share the same mind on that. In Poland, I'm just hypothetically speaking, in Poland, you can get a right wing candidate, and then in Germany, you can get a left wing candidate. And that's entirely based on their political history over the past 70, 80 years. In South America, you don't really have that difference, because when, like, as you mentioned, in South America, you have that wave of military juntas where almost everyone on the continent dealt with that for the better part of anywhere from 20 to 50 years. Same thing with the pink wave, pink revolution. You had pretty much the entire continent go into the left to semi far left position for the better part of 20 to 30 years. And I think that comes down to the fact that, yes, while each of these countries has distinct cultures, at the end of the day, it is a single language. I mean, with the exception of Brazilian Portuguese, but even that's pretty, like, you can put a Portuguese speaker and a Spanish speaker in a room and they'll more or less be able to have a conversation. So at the end of the day, you do really have this more, I wouldn't necessarily say homogenous, but very fluid and easy to mix cultural blob in the entire Latin American region. So you see something like Bukele or Milei get elected, they run these really strong populist waves, and then one by one, all these other candidates in all the other countries will point and say, "Oh, look what they're doing. Wouldn't it be great if we did that here?" And in some cases, that's a pretty easy, gimme kind of message to push, especially again with this wave of young voters, most who haven't even voted before.
So John, let me go to you, because I think this is very interesting from a military deployment perspective, right? I mean, obviously, there's broad agreement that the Donroe Doctrine is becoming successful because of these conservative elections. But what's very interesting, right? And obviously, at least in the short term, obviously we could talk the long term and some of those issues that we have. But what's very fundamentally interesting of this is that after President Trump came into office, and there has been this refocus on the Western Hemisphere and how they viewed the Western Hemisphere directly linked to Homeland Security and Homeland Defense, and this surge of military assets across Latin America, with the strikes against narco boats and drug trafficking boats, mostly concentrated in the Western Pacific. In the Pacific coast of South America, some of them also in the Caribbean and the Atlantic coast. But what's very interesting is the military deployment and the refocus of U.S. military and diplomatic might in South America really didn't have an impact. And if anything, maybe empowered the South American conservatives to gain power. So obviously the military component is not this political issues that maybe a lot of people thought that might have hindered. But I want to focus specifically on the military deployment. And I would love your take on this, because we still have a significant military presence in South America after the operation to capture Nicolas Maduro, the former Venezuelan president. These drone strikes and strikes against these drug trafficking boats, the increase in intelligence assets across South America to disrupt these narco vessels, and now because of the devastating earthquake in Venezuela, we're seeing a significant surge of U.S. military assets into the country for humanitarian response. For our listeners who might not be aware, I would love for you to lay out what are the military assets actually in South America, what does it mean for the United States, and what does it mean for our force posture internationally? Where does South America fit in the overall global picture?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think first off, I'd note the earthquakes and the ongoing rescue operations that are going on in Venezuela right now. There's a number of U.S. forces that have been surged to Venezuela, including search and rescue, State Department search and rescue task forces, U.S. Marines, and a number of other forces across the Navy and the Army that have been surged to Venezuela to help following the twin 7.2 and 7.5 earthquakes that devastated northern Venezuela. So they're there now. There's San Antonio class LPDs that are offshore as we speak in support of operations. There's other vessels nearby. It's also important to know, as you mentioned before, that we're not necessarily fresh off, but we're on the back end of the operation to oust former President Maduro here. And a lot of these assets are still in the region. I think the Wall Street Journal, I believe Bloomberg as well, also did a report on this a few weeks ago, kind of saying that the current U.S. force posture largely remains the same, although some have been diverted to the Middle East and or have gone back up to Norfolk and Mayport as well. But they largely the naval force posture remains the same. As it comes to certain air task forces that have been diverted to the Middle East, those have been rotating back and or actually a few times between the Southcom AOR and the CENTCOM AOR, but they're maintaining a lot of this posture here, which is important to note here. From also from the military perspective, I just want to note here, you mentioned the National Defense Strategy, and I pulled it up because it's hugely important to note that the first couple paragraphs in the National Defense Strategy that was released in January of this year was largely focused on the Western Hemisphere. The first point under one of the first points under defend the U.S. homeland, it talks about, and I'm quoting it now, it says, "We'll provide President Trump with credible military options to use against narco-terrorists, wherever they may be. We'll engage in good faith with our neighbors, from Canada to our partners in Central and South America, but we will ensure that they respect and and do their part to defend our shared interests," right? And so having this kind of large force posture down there kind of acts as a coercive measure as well for nations who may not necessarily be willing to play ball. Nations like Cuba come to mind. And Venezuela could even still come to mind, although, Maduro is out, it still provides that incentive to kind of play ball in the post-Maduro kind of framework here and dynamic. And wider, we also, and kind of the wider geopolitical aspect, we also have increased military to military cooperation with a number of nations, including Mexico, Guatemala, if we're going to be talking about direct operations, those two are the ones I want to talk about first here. We've seen strikes in Guatemala against what they, the administration has characterized as narco terrorist entities, cartel entities generally. We've seen strikes in Guatemala. The most strikes we've seen have been obviously in the South Camaya War, in the Caribbean, and the Eastern Pacific, against small, fast cartel craft as well. We've seen we've kind of plateaued at this. We have about 2 to 3 strikes from Southcom that are being released a week now. The strikes in Guatemala were ongoing a couple months ago. We've seen those kind of pan out as well, but those could resume at any moment as well. And they've also, this is something that's, I think, important to know. They've also signaled increased military-to-military cooperation with Colombia here, post-election here. Now, in preparation for this, I kind of leaned on an SME that I kind of lean on pretty often. Ricky Nomics is somebody that I talk to pretty often. He's down there in Colombia doing some pretty good work. He does everything from close protection. He's also an intelligence analyst. And he told me just yesterday that he has been directly approached by entities that are close to or within the Colombian government to kind of facilitate some of this increased cooperation. And also we're going to be likely seeing, once the new president, Esprilla, is kind of settle in, he quote said, he's likely going to be taking a more hardline stance against non-state actors within the and paramilitary groups as well here. Specifically, one thing he interestingly mentioned to me is kind of and this is getting a little specific, and I won't touch on this very long. One thing he also mentioned to me is it's likely that he's going to champion individual gun rights. Is that kind of a counter to these paramilitary groups here? And we've sort of seen that in some other areas as well, Argentina as well. As it comes to kind of championing gangs and stuff. One thing he mentioned to me is that, obviously, unlike gangs in the United States, who also have guns, things like that, none of these people have we don't have paramilitary groups in the sense that some of these nations in South America do, where they actually have political control. And kind of moving to that political control thing here, sticking into Colombia here, what he was telling me is that I think all of us kind of remember in the immediate after the election last week or 2 weeks ago, the election was sort of contested and there was a call for a recount. And he said, well, actually, they wouldn't want to do that because a lot of these places are in guerrilla controlled areas. And so the former president is unlikely to win that. It would actually look really bad because, for lack of a better term, these people were essentially voting at gunpoint here. And so the recount likely wouldn't be very good if they went by that judicial process there. But yeah, Colombia, I think, is the newest, not necessarily flashpoint, but the newest kind of big update as it comes to U.S.-South America relations here. Obviously, Mexico is also an ongoing thing. We've also seen the ongoing intelligence cooperation with Mexico, and also lack thereof, if you could call it that. We all remember the reports about a month ago of the CIA involvement inside of Mexico, and that's likely ongoing as well. We've seen military-to-military cooperation increase with Mexico as well at the tier 1 and 2 and subordinate levels as well. And so this is something that we're likely going to see increase. Now, zooming out once more to kind of the geopolitical kind of the 30,000-foot view here is, I wrote an assessment a couple months ago before the Venezuela operation, kind of saying that in the same manner that the U.S. does not want to allow certain actors to get into its backyard in other areas in the Pacific and things like that. Even more so, it's not going to allow nations like Venezuela, nations like Cuba to be a hotbed or a jump-off point for our adversaries, state actor adversaries, China, Russia, Iran, etc. And so, I had titled the assessment "Why Donald Trump Has to Get Rid of Maduro," essentially, for something along those lines here. And we're going to be seeing that in other nations like Cuba as well, trying to root out Iranian influence, Russian influence, Chinese influence. We saw Donald Trump do this in Panama as well. And I'd only expect such action to increase here. As you mentioned, the Donroe Doctrine. We've seen formations of the Western Hemisphere Command as well here, and kind of just, renaming things that, may be symbolic, but we're seeing movement behind it as well. And the application of force is also behind that, which is also as that coercive measure, as I added before.
One of the things before I go to Matthew that I would point to is I do look, obviously there's a geopolitical component to this, right? And how the United States is doing this and how they're operating. I do agree Cuba is next. Clearly, Marco Rubio is leading this, the Secretary of State. I think there's a very interesting dynamic between Stephen Miller, the Homeland Security Advisor, and obviously we all know who that is from a policy perspective, especially in the immigration and the border, and Marco Rubio. I think there's some divergence between both and how they want to operate. What's very interesting in the military component, yeah, we've seen U.S. military strikes, in Guatemala, in Ecuador. It's very interesting in Mexico. It hasn't happened, but I think the reason why that hasn't happened is because there's no desire or interest for it to happen, because the Mexicans are doing a lot of our dirty work, for a lack of a better term. But my point to this is, though, my concern is when we're having this conversation, yes, there's a geopolitical aspect of this. Obviously, the United States is trying to remove Chinese influence in South America, Russian, Iranian influence in South America, Cuba and Maduro being the aspect. Look, the Chinese economic power in South America is not going to go away overnight. That is well established. There's other areas that the United States wants to reduce, overall political influence, geopolitical influence, and we're winning on that, and specifically in the military. And I think there's now a push for the economic, which is the medium to long term. But I think people are going to use that and say, well, the United States is using organized crime and cartels and drug trafficking as an excuse, because the real objective is the Chinese perspective. And what I would say is that's not necessarily the truth. Right, we saw with the National Defense Strategy, we see it with these South American governments that are taking a hardline approach, and a lot of these are being demanded by constituents that are demanding the United States and the South American governments to take this hardline approach. And I think people need to understand that this idea that because the United States is doing unilateral strikes against drug trafficking vessels, there might be this idea and perception in the West and the United States specifically, or certain circles, that that's unpopular in South America. And I'd be very careful with making that assumption. If anything, it's on the contrary. Right, there has been ample evidence that these strikes have not given the pushback politically in South America. And what I get to this is that the United States truly views, at least the Trump administration, truly views cartels as a primary national security threat. And I think that really boils down to because of the fentanyl crisis, right? Mexican cartels, organized crimes are a primary threat. This isn't an excuse or a scapegoat to use as a cover to try to push out other governments or other geopolitical powers out of the region. That's not necessarily the truth. That might be an added benefit. And I think in the end of the day, China knows how to operate with whoever. Even when we saw Bolsonaro in Brazil, China still had relationships with Bolsonaro, the right-wing candidate in Brazil. So China's going to be able to adapt and overcome. I do believe there's a difference, though, where the United States it has hard limits, and a lot of these South American countries goes there. But the cartel piece and the organized crime piece and the drug trafficking piece is the threat. Everything else is just secondary and an added benefit. And we see this with the FTO designation, with the Mexican cartels, with the Haitian gangs, with the Ecuadorian gangs, lately with the Brazilian gangs. And this is the fundamental story. I'm not trying to make this a cartel corner. We've had cartel corners talking about a lot of the conflicts across South America between the gangs and the cartels. But I think this is the primary factor is driving this. And what's interesting is that voters in South America support this. And I think Trump is leaning in on this, and he's leveraging this to solidify himself as the primary security backer in the South America, and they fundamentally transformed the conversation of security in South America. And so I think to the listeners, do not believe for a second that President Trump in the U.S. is using cartels as an excuse to focus on other things. Cartels are the threat. Organized crime is the threat. Drug trafficking is the threat. And they are putting the assets and efforts in it to do it. They have fundamentally, the United States Northern Command has fundamentally changed its task organization to address it in the northern border. We've seen a similar approach to Southern Command and the military assets and the diplomatic assets, even the sanctions from the Treasury Department. And this is a whole of government approach that clearly Marco Rubio is taking a much more lead in this and trying to solidify this and make this a whole of government approach. And then obviously we see the Department of Homeland Security do this as well. And I think what we're going to see is South American countries across the board continue to rely on U.S. military power and U.S. military support and U.S. intelligence support to do these types of efforts and these types of operations for the domestic audience. And I think that's the fundamental transformation. And I think even if President Trump or J.D. Vance or Marco Rubio aren't, this is going to outlast them. In 2028, if a Democrat is elected, this idea that the Western Hemisphere is a primary interest of the United States, I think in some way, shape, or form is going to continue. This is the new normal. And I think President Trump has made that before and after, regardless of your political inklings, that you cannot view the Western Hemisphere as a distinct problem set that you can just ignore. I think that is going to transform. So even if you have Democrats in power in 2028, they will acknowledge that maybe obviously the drone strikes and the strikes against drug vessels, those will probably stop. But the momentum has already shifted into a much more militarized aspect to this approach and leveraging U.S. military power to do these operations in South America and be much more overt about it than in the past. But Matthew, I'm going to push it on to you because I think, obviously there's a lot we need to discuss on this and the Donroe Doctrine. I think we do need to expand on the geopolitical sense, but clearly, I think this is since the Cold War, we haven't seen a situation where the U.S. has been so focused on South America, obviously with the last 20 years with GWAT and near peer competition. This is a new era we're kind of walking in ourselves in, but instead of communism, it's basically organized crime.
Yeah, I think it's a good thing overall that the United States is turning more of their attention southward. It makes sense. Like these are our neighbors. The way they're doing it, to me, does not necessarily make sense. And I don't think that they're looking at the long-term outcomes. And I do hope that we'll stop these strikes against these boats that like may or may not be drug boats, and that there'll be some sort of reflection on what was the process for the targeting. But what I do want to do is ask Jonathan a specific question specific to Colombia and whether or not he thinks the Bukele model can actually be applied to Colombia, because I think that there is a lot that is appealing to some of these people that want to bring down the violence and figure out ways for the state to counteract and take action against a lot of the organized or unorganized groups in Colombia. But do you actually think that that is a model that can then be applied to Colombia?
Yeah, I'll give the simple answer, and this is entirely my own opinion, and it's no. But let me go into a little more detail about why. Uh, Colombia is kind of a unique situation because it's not just organized crime that they're dealing with, but it's also FARC, the ELN, and a variety of other small groups that, yes, they are organized crime. That is very much true. They're peddling drugs, primarily cocaine, but I know they've kind of dabbled in with some of the other stuff like fentanyl. Yeah, they're organized criminal groups now, but you do have situations like FARC where they have attempted to reintegrate into the political scene, to demilitarize, to take this more peaceful approach. And that has sort of caused a civil war within the FARC movement, and a lot of portions of FARC have actually broken off into their own independent, you could say like warlord groups. And the same thing goes for the ELN. The ELN really hasn't been so compliant with the uh, demilitarization and the opportunity to rejoin a more political space. And I think my main concern and why I'm a little worried about the next Colombian administration taking that Bukele approach is that these organizations are relatively small compared to their peak. I think FARC has less than 2,000 quote unquote fighters. Obviously, not all 2,000 of those are militants. ELN, I can't really tell you the last number I read that was accurate, but it's not a lot. My concern is that you're going to see the Bukele approach applied, and it's going to re-radicalize these organizations. It's going to radicalize population groups in areas near them. It could even radicalize groups in major population centers to become more open to the ideas of these organizations. And I'm not trying to say that there's going to be a civil war in Colombia in the next 2 years, but my main worry is we live in a very different era. This is not an era where you have militants in the jungles with AK-47s anymore. This is an era where, yeah, it'll still be the same militants in the jungles with AK-47s, but it's not expensive, especially since these groups are already peddling drugs. It's not expensive for a re-radicalized, re-politicized uh, Colombian Liberation Force, any sort of like ELN, FARC. Uh, they can get drones. They could do strikes in major population centers against military and police targets. They can do this out in the jungle as well. And in my eyes, the most extreme version of this is you end up having a Colombia with a small, localized Myanmar type of situation, which I just don't think is very conducive to security in our backyard. Because you have a variety of the governments that would love to take advantage of that across the world that can provide the funding, that can provide the equipment. They don't need to provide anything crazy. I mean, they sometimes they might not even need to give them anything. They can. It's again, these people can go on to online marketplaces across the world. They can acquire drones. They can make the explosives locally or through arms smuggling. And I think this would be a good way for me to hand off the conversation to John with the question of uh, do you kind of agree with my assessment here of what this could become if it's not handled the right way? And do you think it could become a problem, a much larger problem than it currently is? Because I wouldn't really say the FARC ELN issue is a big problem. It is, but it's not a critical issue in this hemisphere. It has the potential to become one. So I'll hand that off to you, John.
Yeah, exactly. I somewhat agree with what you're saying here. In my conversations with some people who were working there yesterday, they kind of said a lot of the same thing. This Bukele kind of dynamic where this quote, "Whoever can serve me, my country best, I will do business with them," kind of dynamic here may not necessarily work when juxtaposed onto when placed onto kind of the dynamic inside Colombia here, because it's obviously not the same one. One thing that some people did mention to me is we could see once Esprilla is able to kind of consolidate his own power base here. We could see it in the same way that Bukele did it. We could see kind of an expansion of the prison industrial complex here. That's something that apparently he's been vocal on, and people in his camp have been vocal on here. That could have that reaction that you're talking about here, from not only the organized crime elements, but the paramilitary elements as well, right? I think that's hugely important to note as well. Now, the last thing that they did mention as well was that he's going to have to somewhat clean house here, not only inside his own camp, but also in the wider government ruling framework here in Colombia, if he wants to get certain things done, like increased military cooperation with the United States and the expansion of the prison industrial complex and things like that here, and also empowering individual gun rights within the country here. A lot of people are going to clash on this. A lot of people, factions, paramilitary factions, organized crime factions will clash on this as well. Obviously, removing the monopoly on violence from adding kind of a third party there outside of the government and these groups is obviously going to cause a bit of a problem here. So I do somewhat agree with you here on that it would cause it could cause a adverse reaction from a lot of these groups here, who still maintain a lot of not only political but just physical power when it comes to causing a lot of trouble and violence within the country here. How bad a reaction we could see here, that remains to be seen here. But I'll flip it to Matt on that one.
So I mean, I think the new government is obviously not going to be as interested in the peace process. So by the very nature of their election, the peace process is going to be undermined. And that could lead to folks who had put down their arms picking them back up. But you brought up something that I think is really important to look at here, which is what happens if they adopt this model of incarceration. And in the near term, in the short term, it might look like, oh, they're really making progress. That's, just we're going to look over the fact that some of those people who are incarcerated probably shouldn't be incarcerated and are going to get caught in this dragnet. But the real threat here, as I see it, is you are going to take these decentralized groups, and you are going to give them a pipeline for recruitment, and you are going to give them command and control within these prisons. This is not a phenomenon that should be unfamiliar to politicians or policymakers in South America. Like that is a real threat. So hopefully one of you guys who has a little bit more expertise on South America could maybe expand on that. And then I think we have to talk about the elephant in the room, which is China.
I guess I'll talk about the radicalization pipeline here, especially regarding these groups. I think these groups, a big reason that FARC kind of came to the table is, they were bleeding members pretty badly over the past 20 years. Not just to death, but also to a lack of direction. And that kind of goes hand in hand with them becoming more of an organized crime group. Same with ELN. Not to say that they weren't doing it in the past, but in the past, I would definitely say that they were definitely, wholly behind the revolutionary goals of their organizations. Um, they've kind of lost that anchor point in the more recent years. And bouncing off what you're saying with the prisons, these, if they follow the Bukele model, it's going to be a lot of people going to prison. It's going to be some people who really shouldn't be in prison being in prison. And once they're in those prisons that are full of FARC members or full of ELN members, it's a pretty easy pipeline for those people to say, well, my government screwed me over. I'm here now. I don't like my government. And you have these groups that are going to be, toting the party line and saying, well, we can take the whole system down. Uh, so there is a worst case scenario where I would say probably FARC, because they're, as far as I know, still the biggest one. You could see them go back over the 2,000 member line. You could see them go even to the 4 or 5,000. Worst case scenario, even the double digits, 10,000 or something like that. And then that becomes a really big problem for Colombia, an extremely big problem for Colombia. It becomes a really big problem for everybody in the region. These groups are not strangers to bleeding over borders. We've seen this in Venezuela. ELN and FARC groups bleed in regularly into that region, into a very unstable country where it's very easy for them to get access to armaments. It's very easy for them to get access to monetary pipelines that they might not have access to in Colombia. So my worry is that there's a very extreme reaction early on that has the potential to cause a much larger problem where the Colombian military is going to have to become a lot more proactive. And if it happens during the Trump presidency, there's even the potential for the US to become a lot more proactive. To what extent, I can't really say. But there is a potential flashpoint for Colombia here that I think is pretty unique to Colombia. Um, and it's just in a very critical region in South America. So I'll leave that to whoever wants to take it, John or Matthew. But I see a lot of potential for issues here.
I mean, I think that we see this again and again with the current administration where uh, it's not this long-term perspective. It's going for short-term gains. And I worry that like a lot of the enforcement early on is going to be performative. And also, it's not just a problem for the United States. Like these gangs and organizations are more and more an international problem. And if we're not coordinating with our partners in Europe, if we're not strengthening ties in Africa, uh, we're going to continue to see, a level of fragmentation and creativity where these organizations find a way to exist in the current environment. And like none of this to me indicates like a uniform policy where they're really thinking, 2, 3, 4 steps ahead. And speaking international, I think the again, like the elephant in the room is Chinese influence. And just because we are seeing conservative governments being elected, conservative leaders, and rhetorically it aligns with Washington, money talks. and I'm sure that Chinese investment into ports and telecoms and mining and infrastructure is still going to be appealing to these leaders. So I think maybe we just take this conversation and kind of direct it towards Chinese influence. And, what are you guys watching in terms of like early indicators that uh, China is going to continue to influence operations in these countries?
Yeah, I think the first off, I'd note it's kind of extension of their Belt and Road Initiative in nations in Central and South America, i.e., Panama, through Hong Kong linked firms. Um, I think that's something that's huge here. Dual use tech as well that they export to a lot of these countries. They're increasing their export, and a lot of these countries are increasing the imports of those too as well. Also, their expansion of buying up land in some of these nations, as well as real estate endeavors in the Caribbean and elsewhere. And then also just military to military and security ties is also a huge thing. They wrote a there's a white paper that China wrote mid last year talking about kind of quote unquote peace programs. And it's really just them exporting their tech and their military technology outside of traditional areas that they normally do, i.e., the Middle East and their immediate backyard. And so we've seen them increase that, and so we've seen kind of this what the national security strategy called the Trump corollary, or what I believe Stefano, as many people call it, many people call it the Donroe Doctrine, kind of this revamping of the Monroe Doctrine, kind of with this Western Hemispheric U.S. control here. We're going to increasingly see the Trump administration seek to increase military to military cooperation with these nations. And then also from an economic perspective, increase kind of our economic cooperation with the nations that we can. Now, obviously, there's as we mentioned kind of before, talking from the political aspects here, there's certain political dynamics that kind of generally need to be in place for some of these nations to work with the United States. Whereas, as kind of was mentioned on the sidelines by you, Matt, right, which was that China really doesn't give a hoot about kind of what the political dynamic in country is. They'll throw money at the situation regardless. And we've seen them do this to great effect with building projects and the like, and economic projects with partner nations or lack thereof in Africa as well here. And they've realized great success there. And we've begun to see them do that here. At the same time, again, this is all happening against the backdrop of this pretty significant this revamping of defense and security commitments from nations all across South America. We see Chile, Peru, Brazil as well, Argentina as well, all revamping kind of the defense and security posture here, increasing their postures. Whether or not they're preparing for anything specific here, there's a significant modernization of in the defense sector in South America. I mentioned and also domestic defense products as well. I mentioned Colombia earlier with the domestic production of the Jaguar rifle. We're seeing a lot of other domestic production going on in South America. Speaking to someone that I'm close friends with who works in the defense procurement industry inside the United States, they've told me that a lot of people are now looking to South America as potential buyers for a lot of different defense products now. And so all of these things are going on against the backdrop of kind of this rearmament of conventional South American militaries. And China is as readily is willing to get, kind of they want a piece of that as well here. And that will also buy them influence within these countries, which in turn buys them influence in the US's backyard, something that Donald Trump is trying to actively prevent, as it was said in the national defense and security strategies.
I don't know if you wanted to go first, Matt, since you undeafened there.
No, the one thing that I was just going to mention with China is I think there is one indicator that goes under the radar, but is very telling, and that would be the distant water fishing fleet. So China's sort of shadow fleet of fishing vessels that operates off the coast of Colombia, operates off the coast of Chile. Um, do we see a crackdown on that, or do they just continue operations? And I think that could serve as one of those indicators in terms of how the regime is reacting to China.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's interesting. One thing I'd mention is Argentina. We've seen Argentina kind of combat in some manner Chinese fishing vessels as well, but I've yet to see kind of this kind of Philippines or Vietnam-esque reaction to Chinese fishing vessels and Chinese, for lack of a better term, militia fleets that act in their backyard here. Whether they want tacit approval or overt approval from the U.S. to do things like that, I think they would need a little more overt backing from the United States to do that, though, and get some level of assurances, because China will react adversely to that, and they'll lead with economic coercive measures first here. So I've yet to see that here, and I think that's important you mentioned, and I did, kind of forget about that dynamic here. But I don't think they yet have the bandwidth to respond at scale to kind of Chinese fishing and other Chinese maritime actions in the local region.
That actually kind of perfectly leads into what I wanted to talk about, which was the fact that a lot of these Latin American economies are extremely intertwined with the rapidly growing Chinese export market. And this is, I mean, automotive, you have stuff like BYD, Qirui, Changsheng, Chang'an, SAIC Motors. You know, compare Latin America now to Latin America not even 5 years ago, no one could tell you about these brands. But now, I hear from people all the time. All the cars in Lima, Peru are BYD cars now. People are using, Chinese electronics like Xiaomi, Oppo, Huawei phones. Uh, Mostly because they're technologically equal, if not slightly better than some Western offerings at a significantly lower price. And that kind of goes into the whole thing of, well, you you can't really I don't really see these countries like putting up too strong of a front, because they don't want to risk being economically cut off from what has become a huge part of their consumer economic space. Everyone's buying these products. Everyone likes these products. It's not like it's just being forced onto them. It's stuff that people are buying because it's perfect for these economies. And of course, it's not like the U.S. where we can ban a company because we already have a domestic or a European alternative. These governments can't ban all these automotive companies. They can't ban all these consumer electronic companies. So they're definitely not going to do something that risks China pulling the plug, in my opinion, um, because there's just not a good alternative. I mean, some people are going to be like, oh well, why don't they just buy American or European products? They can't really do that. I mean, they don't make enough money every year. Like the average person in Latin America doesn't make enough money every year to go buy the brand new iPhone, not even the top of the line model. I'm just talking about like just the plain iPhone, $699. They don't have that kind of money, the average person. They're not going to go buy a Ford F-150. So I think there's a very strong economic incentive to just not do anything, to not really act. They'll do the bare minimum, but they won't do anything hard line. And I really don't see that changing regardless of the government type. It's basically shooting yourself in the foot to close off that entire pipeline of products coming into the region. It's sort of the situation where it's too late. If they were going to do something 5 years ago was the time to do it. It's kind of too late to do that now, unless America turns around and creates a, you know, low cost, consumer friendly export economy in the next 5 years, which I can tell you for sure is just not going to happen. And this kind of leads into a second point I want to make, which bounces off of what John was talking about with Belt and Road and all of China's other international investment schemes. Um, there are no alternatives to that. USAID is dead, for lack of a better word. And even USAID was not a very competitive program, in my opinion. I'm a huge proponent of USAID. I thought it was a very destructive thing to get rid of. Um, but that being said, it wasn't the best program on earth. It's just really hard to compete with that. It's really hard to compete with a country that's willing to dump billions of dollars into overseas infrastructure projects, ranging from roads, ranging from railways, airports, ports, telecommunications, everything. It's really hard to compete with that. These countries aren't going to stop saying no to that. unless America suddenly decides to create something like that, which, in my opinion, not to get too political, they definitely could. Like, we have the economic leeway to do something like that. Um, but until we do, there's not really much we can do in the economic space. Countries aren't going to ban this stuff. They're not going to do anything to risk losing the pipeline, and they're not going to stop saying yes to these projects. It's real. I think a lot of people, for our listeners, I think a lot of people have this misunderstanding that it's very predatory. And while that is the case in some countries, like what happened in Sri Lanka with the $8 billion port that Sri Lanka most certainly was never going to be able to afford, uh, the reality is more often than not, BRI projects are pretty good in terms of the incentives. They tell you we want some sort of like payback scheme in a 20 to 25-year loan system. uh, that's doable for most of these countries. So of course they're gonna keep taking it. I don't know. You guys can disagree with me here, but I don't see these countries just suddenly shutting it off, even with the Donroe Doctrine. There's just not an alternative.
Yeah, I mean, I'd piggyback off what you just said. I think it's hugely important. China demonstrated the political, I mean, the economic leverage that they can have over a nation, and more importantly, demonstrated the economic leverage that they have over a superpower, the United States, during the last year's recent trade war. Short, but it was a trade war nonetheless between the United States and China, restricting rare earth minerals and other key exports to the United States. We didn't really have much of a response here. Every nation who has even less leverage against China was watching that and looking at their own domestic economies and how intertwined they are, as you mentioned, with Chinese economy and Chinese exports, and realizing that there's not much they can do, short of significant U.S. incentive, which, as you just detailed, the U.S. is unlikely to be able to compete with and provide in relation to China here. So I think that's hugely important to note as well, that China demonstrated what they can do to a nation. And, it's kind of like, hey, if we lose to the U.S., what do you think we're going to do to you?
I mean, to me, it looks like China looked at the model of USAID, and instead of cutting it like we've done, they amplified it. And then they said, where else can we apply this? And went out and expanded that just to, standard economic projects. And what we've seen, even in countries like, so if we turn this to Africa for a second, like even in countries where the United States has a vested interest and we are much more involved in the security apparatus of those countries, they will still entertain proposals from China, and not just China. They'll also look to Russia. So, like, Benin would be one example. So, in Cotonou, um, Benin was completely open to allowing Russian vessels to create a port there that they could visit with limited to no notice. Um, that's not in the interest of the United States. And the United States is, people might not realize this, but like we have people on the ground in Benin who are dealing with the spillover from the Sahel. And this is a country that is getting direct support from the United States, more so than any other country. And they're still in conversations with Russia and with China, allowing them access. And that's where we spend so much on the military. And there's obviously an argument, and it's made frequently that we need to invest more in like the State Department. But we also need to look at what China's doing and learn from these economic investments, because that is sort of a blind spot, and we have set ourselves back in recent years.
Yeah, I think, not to turn this into a China episode, but um, the big
Everything
issue
is
that
low key a China episode.
yeah. I think the big issue is going back to the trade war. This is a perfect example. The first trade war against China was extremely destructive during the first Trump administration. It was a very catastrophic series of economic events for China, and China basically went back to the drawing table after the first Trump administration and said, how can this not happen again? They spent the next 10 years building a system that was very robust. And when the second trade war came around, um, I mean, I don't want to say America lost the second trade war, but it definitely wasn't the resounding victory that the first one was. I would say it was more of a draw in some areas, kind of a loss, especially with the rare earth mineral space. Uh, and this kind of this really goes back into what you were saying, Matt, where China has really looked across the world and said, okay, well, our investments were working really well in Southeast Asia, which is where the brunt of the BRI was focused in its nascent years. And they've redirected that into Africa, and in the past, I would say 5 to 7 years, redirected that into Latin America. Uh, this really comes down to the political mindset where they think very long term, uh, not to be Orientalist, where you have people saying, "Oh, China thinks in decades and centuries," but they definitely do think in decades. I would say, at least like short term, they definitely think 10 to 20 years. They're willing to take an economic loss in the short term if they know they're going to get an economic benefit in the long term, which is the case. I think the biggest problem with the American establishment, and this goes for both ends, Republican and Democrat, especially in the context of places like Latin America now, is we think very short term. So if something isn't immediately going to be profitable or have any tangible benefit, there's just not a appetite for that to happen within the State Department, whether that be due to a lack of fresh thought within the State Department, or whether that just be a plain old money problem, is obviously a discussion we can have, but they're not even, I mean, we could definitely say, let's cut 100 billion from the military, but it's a much deeper problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a pretty good point to put a pin in it. If you guys have final thoughts or maybe a path forward that you see for the United States and in South America where we can actually take advantage of these recent wins and how to frame it, I think that's how we can close the pod.
Yeah, one thing I'd say is I think there's a significant likelihood that we could see increased U.S. militarization in the South Commeo War here, right? So as we kind of just discussed how the U.S. kind of economic inroads into South America will be harder than China's, as we realize a lack of success in that respect, will we just turn to kind of military operations or more coercive actions as we have with Cuba, as we have with Venezuela, um, against other nations like Brazil, Peru, or whoever have you. I do think there's a possibility here because I believe I think Jonathan is right here when he mentioned that the Trump administration and also the Trump State Department here is looking for kind of this immediate gratification kind of effect here, and when they realize that that's not going to happen and they have to play some level of long game, whether it's economic or military cooperation here with these nations here, they're going to turn to more coercive measures. And I think we've seen the Trump administration readily willing to turn to coercive measures, especially as it relates to the Caribbean, Central America, and South America. And it's likely that those will increase here.
I pretty much wholeheartedly agree. My closing statements will be pretty much the same. Just, I guess, going back to the beginning of the episode when we talked about Colombia, definitely calling for a cautious approach in that space is going to be necessary. It has the potential to blow up into something pretty dangerous. So, as we go into what is looking like a more proactive presence in Latin America, we really need to count everything and make sure that we don't make a mistake that will loom over us for the next 10 to 20 years, because there's a lot of chances for that. We need to optimize our approach, uh, so that there is some benefit, but also not some long-term issues.
And I would say there is an opportunity here to take advantage of the momentum, but don't settle for performative security actions. Like that is the biggest pitfall that I think we're facing at this time. But This has been the Bottom Line Up Front, an Artorias podcast, and we will talk to you soon.